D.H. Lawrence once wrote that tragedy is like an acid that dissolves everything except for the very gold of the truth. But if that's the case, it makes me wonder how to interpret the case of John Money. Never in my life have I seen an individual so well suited to the endless series of manufactured outrages and 2-minute hates that is the internet. According to those on the internet, John Money invented and pioneered gender, and his research is still the backbone of modern-day research into transgenderism, or at the very least a case study that encapsulates everything that's wrong with modern research into gender. But this is not the case. And what if instead of tragedy being the acid that reveals the truth, it's instead a coagulant that stiffens lies and misinformation and produces so much grime that blocks out the truth? There's my little slam poetry session. Now we actually get to get into the video. But first, I think we should let the folks on the internet explain the John Money and David Reimer case for me.
Hey, a little trivia for you. Did you know that gender is a social sciences term from 1955, coined by a sexologist named John Money?
He was among the first to take the word gender out of the realm of grammar and apply it to people. Because until him, we never said that people have a gender. Well, people have a sex, and gender is, words have gender.
But John Money thought differently. He thought if, say, a boy were socialized enough to be a girl, that boy could fundamentally be a girl.
And that we are born gender neutral. So that when we're born, even a normal child, he proposed, is born without any propensity or quality, masculine or feminine qualities.
Jumping to 1965, the birth of twins Bruce and Brian Reimer, the boys are born healthy except for a condition called phimosis, which affects the foreskin. And it was decided incorrectly, it turns out, that the best way to treat the condition was circumcision.
That boy was raised as a girl.
Money described the experiments as successful, though David never ended up identifying as a woman and described his visits with Money as traumatic.
And he actually began living as a boy around 15 years old.
Still, ultimately, Money was convinced that his project had been a smashing success, and he bragged of his triumphs in many published works. But it was not a success.
It was celebrated all across academia.
Suffice it to say, he was an extremely influential man, and anybody who propagates left-wing gender theory today is repeating at least some of the ideas of John Money, whether they know it or not, and most of them do not know it.
Well, David's brother Brian became schizophrenic, overdosed on antidepressants. He died. David then himself blew his head off with a sawed-off shotgun. By the way, that's not a cry for help. That's someone with some follow-through.
Now, their deaths go down in history as suicides, but they were both effectively murdered by John Money, who's the father of modern gender theory. And that's the birth of gender ideology as we know it today. It was born in abuse and despair and death. And that is what it has reaped ever since.
Disclaimer, nothing I say is in any way an endorsement of John Money or the things that he did. The outrage at what he did to the Reimers is entirely justified, and from what I've read, he seems like a massive piece of shit. That being said, very little of this video is going to be about the person John Money himself, which I recognize probably sounds strange to a lot of you, but I think there's a lot more utility in looking at how anti-trans activists and conservative types interpret the case of John Money. Should we be disturbed by John Money? Well, yeah, probably. But more importantly, what can we take from the story of John Money? What have we taken already historically? And is the legacy of John Money problematic? Part 1. John Money, the history of transgenderism, and you. Before we get into the implications of the Reimer case, I actually want to talk about the history of gender a little bit. After all, when we talk about the dark history of gender ideology or whatever else, we're essentially making a historical argument. This requires context. So I'm gonna give it to you. Despite what certain documentaries might have you believe, different modes of gender expression have historically been relatively common in Africa, Asia, and pre-colonial North America. The Malay in Ethiopia had the idea of ashtime, which were biological men that, quote, dressed like women, performed female tasks, cared for their own houses, and, apparently, had sexual relations with men. The ashtime were a third gender of sorts, considered unable to fully perform male or female tasks. The Malay had a pretty complex gender system just in general, which ranked people on a scale from Giga Chad ritual kings to Chad light subchiefs and so on and so forth, and each subsequent lower rank was considered a little bit more soy and a little bit more feminine than the last. In Sudan, there was a healing cult called Zar that usually only women were allowed to participate in. However, if you might be something like a male homosexual, you might be allowed to participate. Or if you bleed from your penis or your anus, this might make you a woman symbolically, which would then allow you to join. In Oman, there was the idea of a khanith, which could be argued is also a third gender category. It was associated with cross-dressing, prostitution, and homosexuality. This is to say nothing of the now famous third genders in India or Thailand, or to say anything of the Native Americans and the now famous idea of two-spirit, which is kind of a Western term which homogenizes a bunch of different ideas, but which comes from the Ojibwe term, which designated a person who was considered to have embodied both masculine and feminine spirits. Turning our attention to the West, there's still no shortage of alternative gender presentations. The ancient Greeks and Romans had what some classicists have dubbed the one-sex model. Because male and female were defined respectively by their fluids and their temperature, with men being hot and women being cool, changing these temperatures had the serious risk of actually changing who you were in terms of your gender. Women who became too hot had the threat of literally becoming men, and men who cooled down also had the danger of being force feminized. In Scotland and England, there was the idea of a female husband, biological women who lived as men, oftentimes taking on wives of their own. This was unfortunately hundreds of years before the innovation known as the boy wife, another proud Scottish tradition. Female husbands were controversial figures, and were generally unsupported by their local communities. But they still did sometimes find romantic partners, and often overcame hardship to lead what I might hesitantly call normal lives. According to the historian Jen Mannion, the UK press largely lost interest in such stories, possibly because they occurred less frequently, but probably because the concept had run its course as an attention-grabbing headline that sold papers. The US press grew by leaps and bounds during this era, and adopted this long-standing British custom as its own. In US newspapers in the 1840s and 1850s, female husbands were seen as a part of the growing women's rights movement. In the 1870s, they were associated with poverty and vagrancy. By the 1880s, they were cast as precursors to and legitimizers of same-sex relationships. Accounts of female husbands in the news increasingly emphasized sex over gender, arguing that those assigned female were really women, and therefore could not be husbands. My point is this. When we talk about gender, we aren't basing these observations off the ravings of one guy, but rather off of a fairly basic and honestly obvious observation about reality. To say that we should in any way be troubled by our idea of gender because the term had a problematic origin is to ignore the very real basis this idea has in reality. But even setting that aside, John Money is not the origin of our modern ideas about gender. Not by a long shot. In the 1910s, the scientist Eugene Steinach did sex change experiments on rats and guinea pigs. This animal research then paved the way for research surrounding gender and sex changes in humans, which began in the 1920s. German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld described the idea of a, quote, spiritual transsexualism, which sounds an awful lot like many of our modern ideas of gender. But then in the 1930s, everybody's favorite goose steppers came in to dispose of the research. Understandably, modern anti-trans advocates don't like calling this the origin of gender ideology, even though it would be far more accurate. By the mid-1950s, sociologists and anthropologists were using the term sex role, quote, to refer to the culturally determined expected behavior of women and men. And then it was John Money who essentially took this idea of a sex role and turned it into the idea of gender and a gender role. According to one of his essays, The Conceptual Neutering of Gender and the Criminalization of Sex, among psychologists there developed an academic application of the term sex role to refer to a person's social role as a male or female. Dimorphism of the anatomy of the genitalia was taken for granted as the criterion of male and female, though the social use of the genitalia in private as a component of sex role was prudishly evaded. There could be no defense of such prudishness in the case of birth-defective sex organs. Quite the contrary. In these cases, the role of the genitalia in male or female relationships cannot be taken for granted. It must be specified. It is, indeed, literally the sex role, the genital and erotic sex role. Its masculine or feminine completeness is a function of the original nature of the birth defect and of the degree of success achieved by surgical intervention. I could not use the term sex role to mean the genito-erotic sex role, since it already had been preempted to mean the non-genito-erotic social sex role. I might have made do with complex expressions like social sex exclusive of genital sex, or social sex inclusive of erotic imagery as male or female. To avoid this pedantry, I decided not to further overburden the word sex, which already must do service as a civil status as well as an activity in bed. Instead, I borrowed gender from its sequestered place in grammar and philology, and used it in the term gender role. In other words, the term gender role was made in order to shift away from the connotations of the existing term sex role, not as a wholesale replacement of meaning. Even John Money, who frankly always oversold the novelty of his own work, admits that he didn't even come up with anything that novel here. But many academics argue that John Money didn't even come up with the idea of gender at all. Similar claims about sex as it relates to social roles had already existed since Freud, we just didn't call it gender yet, and Freud's theories were not thoroughly explored. The sex-gender distinction in psychology, at least when it comes to terminology, dates back to the 1940s, and was not the product of John Money, but of a relatively obscure scientist named Isaac Madison Bentley. Some argue that Simone de Beauvoir expanded upon the ideas of Bentley.
On n'est pas femme, on le devient.
Oui, c'est en somme la formule qui résume l'ensemble de mes thèses. Et ce qu'elle signifie est très simple, c'est que être femme, ce n'est pas une donnée naturelle. C'est le résultat d'une histoire. Et plus les études psychologiques sur les enfants s'approfondissent, plus il est sensible, plus on voit avec évidence que vraiment le petit bébé féminin est fabriqué pour devenir une femme.
Les différences biologiques qui sont évidentes, vous considérez qu'elles ne jouent pas de rôle dans le comportement ultérieur éventuel de l'individu?
Je pense qu'elles peuvent en jouer un, si, elles en jouent un certainement. Mais l'importance qui leur est accordée, l'importance que prennent ces différences, vient du contexte social dans lequel elles se situent. Je veux dire que, bien entendu, c'est très important qu'une femme puisse être enceinte, avoir des enfants, tandis que l'homme ne le peut pas. Ça fait une grande différence entre les deux. Mais ce n'est pas cette différence qui fonde la différence de statut et l'état d'exploitation et d'oppression auquel est soumise la femme. C'est en quelque sorte un prétexte au cours duquel se construit la condition féminine. Mais ce n'est pas cela qui détermine cette condition.
The only person who I know of who points out some of this pre-John Money history of gender is StevenCrowder. This isn't really important to my argument, I just kind of thought it was interesting. And in the mid-20th century, we started to develop the ideas of primary, secondary, tertiary, and fourth-order sexual characteristics. And while I have no doubt you're familiar with what a primary and a secondary sexual characteristic is, I believe that when we get into the tertiary and fourth-order category, that's when things start to get pretty interesting. The tertiary characteristic was the sex drive, and the fourth-order characteristics were, quote, traits, mannerisms, and even occupations and clothes. And when all these ideas came together, primary, secondary, tertiary, and fourth order, they all combined to create the idea that just like having a penis or having a vagina might not be all there is to being male or female. It opened up the ground to say maybe there's something social that is implicated in our understanding of how men and women are. Don't get me wrong, John Money was important in the sense that he was a popularizer of a lot of our modern ideas of gender. That is to say, gender roles, not gender identity, which I will note is something different and was created by a completely different guy, Robert Stoller. To put it in its most simplified terms, a gender role is the role that you perform, and your identity is your inbuilt feeling of being a man or a woman. Even setting that aside, what's more is that the evolution of how we understand this term gender did not end with John Money either. But you'll have to wait until our next segment to learn about that. It's also worth noting that John Money's botched sex change surgery was nearly 15 years after Christine Jorgensen made waves in America as the first famous trans woman in the country. The Jorgensen case is no small detail. In fact, it's because she bursted onto the public scene that we even started having debates about what it meant to be a man and what it meant to be a woman in the 1950s and the 1960s to begin with. In addition to Jorgensen, a few more trans people had also emerged in very public spaces, a fact even admitted by John Colapinto, a journalist who was highly critical of John Money and the Reimer case. What's more, German emigre to America Harry Benjamin introduced the idea of a transsexual in 1939, some 30 years before the Reimer case. Around the same time as Money was writing, he also said, "There is hardly a word in the English language comparable to the word sex in its vagueness and its emotional content. It seems definite, male or female, and yet is indefinite. The more sex is studied in its nature and implications, the more it loses an exact scientific meaning. The anatomical structures so sacred to so many come nearer and nearer to being dethroned. Only the social and legal significances of sex emerge and remain." Those who are critical of the Money case will also frequently claim that John Money established the first gender clinic at Johns Hopkins. This is technically true, though like with a lot of things related to John Money, it's missing some context. While it is true that John Money established the first clinic dedicated to gender identity, 2 years prior, Reed Erickson, a transgender man, established the Erickson Educational Foundation, which also did research into gender. And it was partially with the funding of Erickson that John Money was able to get his clinic at Johns Hopkins established to begin with. So, like with a lot of things, we have to keep in mind that John Money was writing and doing his research at the same time as other people. And research happened before John Money, and research happened after John Money. In this light, it's kind of weird the attitude that anti-trans people have towards John Money of some type of lone soldier, a person whose twisted mind was uniquely capable of conjuring up the twisted fabrication of gender. But even if we did place so much of the blame on John Money, the way in which we conceive of gender did not remain static after John Money popularized the term. And of course, this leads us into talking more about how gender has changed since John Money. You see, this idea that John Money is the architect of gender ideology has its roots in actually not one but two different ideas. The first is that he was actually the creator of those ideas, which I hopefully just demonstrated is not true. And the second is that John Money's understanding of gender is continuous with a modern-day left-wing understanding of gender.
And that's the birth of gender ideology as we know it today. It was born in abuse and despair and death. And that is what it has reaped ever since.
If you're paying attention, you'll remember that John Money's primary interest was that of hermaphrodites and intersex children. And for the first few years after the idea of a gender role took off, that was mostly what the phrase was used to describe. The relevance to David Reimer was that he was considered to be a person of ambiguous gender. This is because the penis, which was considered to be the most important signifier of being a man at the time, was absent. So the question was, how could he really be male if he did not have a penis? And how should we understand his gender in light of this absence? However, even in cases like that of the Reimers, the term gender role was not really widely used when it was first made. If you want to know just how obscure the phrase gender role initially was, consider the fact that only one PhD dissertation used the phrase gender role throughout the entirety of the 1950s and 1960s. While it is true that several transgender people were early adopters of the term gender role, the term did not enter into wide circulation. In fact, the word gender was barely used in feminist publications before 1975. You can count the citations on two hands, and I have mentioned most of them. This slow uptake indicates that the term gender was not essential to developing the feminist concept of the constructed nature of feminine and masculine attributes. Even when the phrase gender role caught on a bit more with feminists, which it did during the emergence of women's studies in the 1970s, the way that feminists used the term gender really differed quite a bit from the way that Money used it. In fact, an interesting thing to note is that the time in which feminists really started to take a liking to the term gender was when it stopped being really associated with the type of scientific research that Money was doing altogether. Feminist gender ceased to be associated with its uncomfortable sources in medicalized clinics, characterized by what we would now call heteronormativity, sexist definitions of male and female, binarism, or, in recent interpretations, racism and an expanse of biopolitical power. Despite what many commentators might have you believe, feminists actually did not love John Money, and the feeling was mutual. Money was also not a huge fan of gender deconstructionism, which he decried as bringing about the conceptual neutering of gender. But putting these little nitpicks aside, what did John Money actually believe made somebody a man or a woman? Well, like I hinted at earlier, to Money, the most important signifier of being a man was cock. Without the penis, the child was considered to be in an unacceptable state of gender ambiguity, which it was believed would hamper him when he tried to socialize, tried to make friends, and inevitably have normal heterosexual intercourse. As I've mentioned a few times by now, John Money's main interest was in hermaphroditism. He was looking for a term that would allow him to discuss the situation of a person, for example, without male genitalia, but living and functioning as a man in every way, except for genital copulatory sex. For Money, this meant that the man could not fulfill the male sex role. Hence, without the creation of the term gender role, Money and his colleagues had no way to discuss the subject's behavior. Now, to really understand Money's theories, I would have to explain something like this to you. But don't worry, I'll spare you. However, what you should take away is this. While John Money increasingly did place a high emphasis on gender roles and the socially constructed nature of these gender roles, he did not believe that this constructionism applied to sex roles. Thus, he thought that these people were kind of in a bit of a different state, where you're unable to fully perform a sex role, even as you might be able to perform a certain gender role. And to Money, this gender role often took a secondary importance to the almighty Pingus. In fact, according to Lauren Schechter, John Money's research of this period helped reinforce the idea of the primacy of the body, and the belief that sexual expression, even when expressed by gender signals rather than erotic intention, that did not conform to heterosexual norms was at best the manifestation of deformity. Because of the inherently complicated nature of the Money case, interpretations of what exactly to take away from his writings have varied from expert to expert. Some researchers, such as Ian Moreland, have put more emphasis on the idea that Money viewed gender in constructionist terms. However, I do not think that this is the case. Take the example of Sexual Signatures, a book by John Money that seeks to be a roadmap to show you where you are now as a man or a woman and how you got there. In this book, Money states that neither the nature nor nurture view of gender is right in and of itself, but that the truth is that you are the product of continual interaction between your heredity and your environment. In fact, Money did not believe that you could separate nature from nurture, meaning that any social process was to him also one that must be inherently rooted in biology, at least a little bit. Similarly, he thought that the social world of gender could not be separated from the physical world of sex. In fact, Money and his colleagues themselves clarified that their views were not a theory of environmental and social determinism. Moreover, while Money did believe that gender roles were an essential condition under which gender identity was formed, he also at the same time believed that transgenderism and other forms of alternative gender identities were a deviance to be avoided. He also believed that the ability to be able to change your biology to match very traditional ideas of masculinity or femininity were very important in truly meeting the definition of what it meant to be a man or to be a woman. Nowadays, we believe that altering your physical appearance is important to be able to alleviate feelings of dysphoria. However, Money's primary concern was not gender dysphoria. Money's primary concern was that of social function. In other words, Money believed that people who did not have cisgendered identities would have difficulty fully integrating into society, and therefore transgender treatment should be allotted on the basis that it would make their social functioning easier. In this framework, treatment was assigned to make people conform to a binary model of male or female, wherein truly being male or truly being female was to perform certain activities associated with that gender. What John Money was really trying to do is he was trying to fix intersex people, to bring them into societally accepted standards of a binary view of male or female. Money's conception of gender is different from that of modern-day trans advocates in the three most important of ways. Most trans advocates do not see surgical sex change as fundamentally important to being male or female. They see gender as a spectrum, which is different from the binary model of Money. And most importantly, they don't think that you become trans because societal conditioning pushes you in that direction. If you need proof of this, visit literally any trans-friendly community. Memes frequently mock the idea that you can trick somebody into being trans, and the pro-trans part of the scientific community generally looks down upon the idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria, which argues that social contagion is the driver of the increase in transgender identification. In fact, when you look at the Reimer case, This idea that we can just trick people into being trans or condition them into being trans is the very heart of what money is essentially saying. And this very fundamental idea is simply not supported by modern advocates of transgenderism and gender-affirming care. To summarize, while we can say that the views of modern-day trans advocates are comparable to those of money in some ways, there are also a lot of key elements that distinguish them. Moreover, money made the idea of a gender role, which was just a different articulation of the idea of a sex role, which itself was simply made to describe an older, existing anthropological reality, and this term was different from a gender identity, a term made by a different guy. Money also showed an overwhelming concern in making people conform to traditional gender roles in a binary view of gender, a rejection of gender ambiguity that is uncommon in the trans community. Moreover, even if John Money was just the blueprint onto which all ideas about gender-affirming care had been based, that still wouldn't necessarily invalidate the idea of gender. Lots of scientific discoveries and treatment options have been discovered through some pretty depraved experiments. One of the most famous examples is gynecology. In the second experiment, Dr. J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of modern gynecology, used 3 Alabama slave women to develop an operation to repair vesicovaginal fistulas. Between 1845 and 1849, the 3 slave women on whom Sims operated each underwent up to 30 painful operations. The physician himself described the agony associated with some of the experiments. The first patient I operated on was Lucy. That was before the days of anesthetics, and the poor girl on her knees bore the operation with great heroism and bravery. This operation was not successful, and Sims later attempted to repair the defect by placing a sponge in the bladder. This experiment too ended in failure. He noted, the whole urethra and the neck of the bladder were in a high state of inflammation, which came from the foreign substance. It had to come away, and there was nothing to do but to pull it away by main force. Lucy's agony was extreme. She was much prostrated, and I thought that she was going to die. But by irrigating the parts of the bladder, she recovered with great rapidity. Sims finally did perfect his technique, and ultimately repaired the fistulas. Only after his experimentation with the slave women proved successful did the physician attempt the procedure with anesthesia on white women volunteers. If we wanted to talk more specifically about treatments for those who are suffering mentally, we could refer to the number of discoveries that were made in mental asylums. Bear with me, I swear that this example will make sense eventually. While I don't want to sound like I'm suggesting that modern societies are great to the mentally ill, many useful and valuable treatments have been discovered within the walls of insane asylums. Mental institutions have a long history which arguably dates back to the Arab world, but while their history is no doubt interesting, I'm going to confine my scope to the past few hundred years. We'll begin our story in Britain in the late 18th century, where madmen are roaming our streets and disrupting our public order. To stop them, we take them against their will and lock them up in what are essentially prisons. Now, these madmen were frequently just people deemed to be an embarrassment to the local community. Women who were deemed too sexually active, those who wrote things that were too scandalous, especially about the government, or those who caused too much of an inconvenience to their relatives. In Britain, the madhouse was a profit-making venture. The wealthy paid a fee to the madhouse, and in return, the madhouse would take inconvenient or embarrassing relatives off their hands. These patients were often subject to physical and psychological abuse. Many men saw potential cash and fame in the treatment of these patients as well, whether that treatment came in the form of asylum management, spiritual help, or any other sort of assistance. Fear not, the savior said. All that these men need is a few rounds of evacuation, depletion, and bleeding. To recap, some overzealous gentlemen with elaborate social theories did terrible things to treat people who often neither wanted nor needed their help. Sound familiar? Well, let me just remind you that many of our treatments and our understanding of mental illness are continuous with the treatments that occurred in these asylums. Are we to conclude from this that the best option is to simply give up all treatments for the mentally ill that occur within institutionalized settings? If not, why should we abandon medical treatments for gender dysphoria just due to its unsavory association with one questionable researcher? Today, mental health services are different in a number of ways. However, their DNA is inextricably tied to the history of the asylum. All sorts of treatment have some degree of continuity with older, existing forms of treatment, and transgenderism and gender-affirming care are no exception. So you might be saying, what is different, and what do people view as being the same that causes them to be concerned about the case of John Money? Well, I believe that the answer to that is the question of consent. Part 2. Consent. You know, it's baffling to me when conservatives trot out John Money as this big secret that the left doesn't want you to know about. Basically every history of transgenderism mentions him, and every manual for treatment of gender dysphoria or gender reassignment surgery usually mentions him at some point in the writings. Plus, my man has his own Wikipedia page. It's not exactly arcane knowledge. The most enduring count of John Money in the case of the rhymers is John Colapinto's book entitled As Nature Made Him, a title which itself implies the primacy of biology in determining gender identity. To those that claim that male and female are mere biological categories, the answer is obvious. David had a certain set of gender rules thrust upon him by researchers. However, his natural tendencies pulled him in the direction of manhood because he was as nature made him. But to take the case of David Reimer as a complete rejection of the force of gender roles would be a mistake. Nobody lives in a vacuum, and many of David's formative moments of epiphany draw from his inability to live up to certain gendered social roles associated with femininity.
Since your earliest memories, you never felt like you were a boy, a girl?
I never quite fit in. Well, the girls would do their things with their Barbies and things like that, and that wouldn't interest me. Mm-hmm. And things such as trucks and building forts and, getting into the odd fist fight and mm-hmm. climbing trees, that's the kind of stuff that I like, but it was unacceptable, so I'd never...
As a girl?
As a girl, I had no place to fit in. I tried to fit in. Mm-hmm. I tried with the makeup, and it turned out to be a disaster. I mean, you got the red circles on the cheeks, and I look like a clown, basically. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And but I didn't do it because I liked it. I did it because I wanted so desperately to fit in because I was so lonely.
Now, maybe natural biological urges did push him to perform certain actions or to feel comfortable with certain roles. Maybe they didn't. I'm not here trying to make a definitive statement on the degree to which biological tendencies pushes people to perform certain traditionally gendered activities. What I am trying to say is that I'm skeptical of the way in which anti-trans advocates use the case of David Reimer to say definitively that certain gender roles are all about biology. We often hear the refrain that just because a boy likes dolls, that doesn't make him a woman, and other statements of that vein. This is, of course, true, but note how David's desire to fulfill certain roles and his rejection of traditionally feminine roles is taken as proof of him being male. On the one hand, liking or disliking certain activities associated with the opposite gender is not a sign that you actually are that gender. On the other hand, if it supports a biological essentialist view of gender, The rejection of certain activities associated with the opposite gender is taken as proof of being the gender you were assigned at birth. In her book, Lost in Transnation, the author Miriam Grossman makes an argument along the same lines. Far from accepting his gender reassignment, David had fought against it tooth and nail from the beginning. He had refused to play with dolls, ripped his dresses off, and preferred wrestling to cooking. He even urinated standing up when possible. Brenda had been teased relentlessly for the boyish way she moved, spoke, and gestured. Kids called her Cave Woman. In 2nd grade, she wanted to be a garbage man, and in 8th, a car mechanic. Here, a preference for stereotypically male activities is taken as proof that David Reimer was actually the gender that he was assigned at birth. Whereas if we took the opposite argument and we said that maybe David Reimer liked dolls or liked princesses, we wouldn't take that as proof of David Reimer being a woman. I mean, the only thing there that necessarily suggests a biological tendency is a preference for peeing standing up. Now, nothing about this is to diminish the struggle that David Reimer went through, and the very real distress that was doubtlessly caused to him by having certain feminine roles enforced upon him, in addition to other very obviously abusive behaviors that John Money was guilty of. The only reason why I bring it up is to bring attention to what I see as a hypocrisy that is committed by anti-trans advocates. When right-wing commentators point to the story of John Money, the implications about the nature of gender identity are threefold. 1. Money, despite his best efforts, was unable to impose a gender identity onto David Reimer against his will. 2. Many people are still trying to push transgender ideologies onto your kid. 3. Many gullible kids will become victims of the ideology of their parents. However, by their own admission, Money's attempt to prove the plasticity of gender was unsuccessful, which undermines the argument that many of these same people make about social contagion theory. Figures such as Matt Walsh and Jordan Peterson have frequently invoked the idea that societal factors could have caused an increase in transgenderism. But the case of Money, if anything, attests that you cannot persuade people into changing their gender so easily. If Walsh genuinely believed that you cannot trick people into being trans, he likely wouldn't have much of a career. And of course, this is what opens up the Pandora's box of the issue of consent. I frequently see the opinion that, well, John Money did it against David Reimer's will, whereas modern-day professionals proceed with gender-affirming care because the minor in question has expressed interest. While I agree broadly with this argument, I think it in many ways misses the point that anti-trans people are trying to make. People who are anti-trans do not generally see transgenderism as emerging from an organic desire on the part of minors to present themselves in gender non-conforming ways, but rather as something being imposed upon them by society. To them, transgenderism is something new, something that is the product of an ideology, and therefore something that children would not have organically discovered if not for external actors having put it in their heads. Whatever discomfort they have, whether it be in the form of gender dysphoria or any other gender-related anxiety, is entirely the product of adults. Therefore, how can we say that children are transgender if it's all the idea of adults, and adults are the one pushing to take their children to get treatment for the idea that they themselves have planted in their children's heads? Johnny the Walrus is a children's book written by Matt Walsh. Hello again, Matt. Which follows Johnny who pretends to be a walrus. It's basically just the attack helicopter joke rephrased. Hello Amazon's bestsellers list. This book is the brainchild of one of the largest conservative pundits and received thorough praise from most of the regular big who's who of conservative commentary. It essentially seeks to argue that gender dysphoria is at best something kids might momentarily feel, but is caused by overly enthusiastic liberal parents. The point is that Johnny likes to play pretend, and he pretends to be a walrus. And then his parents are convinced that means he actually is a walrus. Then they have surgeries and shit to affirm his walrus identity. The point is obvious. The book portrays transgenderism as a passing fad. Johnny had also claimed to be a dinosaur and a knight in shining armor before he said he was a walrus. And he's only now stuck being a walrus now that his parents have decided to read too deeply into his temporary phase. This is the groomer narrative. Children don't organically develop transgender identities, but rather will temporarily adopt them due to social influence from liberals and other left-wing types. Therefore, to understand the role of consent, we also have to on some level understand what causes gender dysphoria to begin with. After all, if we don't delve into this question of does gender dysphoria come from within or without, we can't possibly hope to resolve the question of consent, and therefore we can't really say with any certainty the degree to which John Money's ideas might be continuous or discontinuous with our own ideas of gender and gender-affirming care. I won't pretend that the scope of this video allows for a detailed treatment of what gender dysphoria is or the medical ethics of treating it, but I will try to do my best in the time allowed, and I'll link videos that deal with the topic in greater detail. I also won't speak to the current medical debate about the best way to treat gender dysphoria, but what I will say is this. If gender dysphoria is to be treated with gender-affirming care, then there's no reason to suspect that the protocol would be different for any other kind of medical treatment. Of course, I recognize that anybody who is potentially hate watching this video likely does not believe in the validity of gender-affirming care, and much of the criticism of trans healthcare comes from the way in which it is allegedly based upon faulty, if not fraudulent, research. Suffice to say, I'm skeptical of these claims, but I kind of want to put them to one side to talk more specifically about the idea of consent. Admittedly, I'm no expert, not even close, but here is the way in which this topic is generally treated to my knowledge. In medical ethics, there are two interrelated concepts. These concepts are consent and assent. Consent requires, quote, legal ability to enter into a valid contract, and the psychological or developmental decisions. Hence, minors cannot give valid consent, but they may give assent. In other words, it's the job of the adult to actively seek out what treatment they think is best for their child, but the child must often assent to the treatment being performed upon them. The Reimer case would be an example of consent without assent. The parents consented to the medical treatment of David, but there was no assent on the part of David. Consent and assent are a big point of contention in medical ethics. In the first place, there are many times in which the assent of children is overwritten by medical necessity. Anybody who was held down as a kid so that they could get their blood drawn, like me, can attest to this fact. However, as you get older, the way in which doctors weigh the degree to which you can assent changes. At 15, your assent is still not weighted as heavily as your parents' consent, but the ethical principle of pediatric assent recognizes that children, especially adolescents, are capable of participating at some level in decision-making related to their care. The assent requirement seeks to respect children as individuals with emerging autonomy. Above all else, assent is about respecting children's developing capacity, assisting them in understanding their condition and treatment at a developmentally appropriate level, and involving them in appropriate decision-making tasks. A child is unlikely to be able to override the consent of their parents in most medical scenarios. However, as they develop, they will increasingly be considered more able to have a say in their treatment, even if the parent has the final word the majority of the time. However, if a parent fails to seek out some form of treatment for a medical issue, this may be considered a form of neglect. By contrast, I will acknowledge that I think the concern about over-medicalization is, to some extent, a legitimate one. When conservatives speak of the inability of children to consent, they are appealing to an alleged lack of understanding on the part of children, who are unable to comprehend the complexities of gender-affirming care. It should go without saying that this is also a pretty complex issue. Children suffering from all sorts of medical distress are frequently unable to articulate the exact problem that they are suffering from. A child does not understand the full complications of a stroke or a hemorrhage, and neither do most adults for that matter. And yet, we consider the ability to undergo these treatments as important. In the arena of mental health, a child with depression or bipolar might not be able to adequately convey his internal world and the disorder that comes with it. But medical professionals can still understand, or at the very least take a good stab at understanding, if the proper medical procedure is followed. My bottom line is that I think that whatever we decide is the best way to treat gender dysphoria should simply be consistent with the standard medical ethics model of consent and assent. And, to my knowledge, current medical practice surrounding gender dysphoria currently meets these criteria in a way that they didn't during the experiments of John Money. Unfortunately, it's not within the scope of this video for me to be able to tell you about the validity of transgender identities more generally, but for now, that's my piece on the issue of consent. Now that we have dealt with the history of gender identity and touched upon ideas of consent, the last thing I want to do is to actually discuss the figures that I foreshadowed that I would talk about in the beginning of this video. First, we get to talk about psychiatrist and lobster drug enthusiast, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. In one of Jordan Peterson's more famous videos, he sits down to talk with Miriam Grossman. Now, I didn't know who this woman was before I started researching this video, so I looked her up and... hoo boy. Out of curiosity, I tracked down an electronic copy of her most recent book, Lost in Transnation, A Child Psychiatrist's Guide Out of the Madness. Spoiler alert, it's not exactly an academically rigorous book. It opens with a foreword from Dr. Jordan Peterson himself, who gives a perfectly meh opening to the book. It's basically just like the woke mind virus trope again of like, ooh, sometimes ideas, they spread like viruses. Kind of whatever. The writing is a bit more competent than the rest of the book, if excessively rambly, and while I'm not trained in science, everything is cited correctly to my knowledge. The rest of the book does not meet this mediocre standard. You see, the book is trying to provide an alternative to university press type publications. Therefore, the book is furnished with a lot of the trappings you would expect of an academic book, like footnotes and citations. The only problem is that these things are done incorrectly. The citation list for each chapter is pretty short, and many of the items cited are done so incorrectly. For example, a lot of these citations are literally just YouTube links. Grossman cites her own books, which I will remind you are also not academic, in addition to Christopher Rufo and other sources of doubtful merit. But you want to know who isn't cited, though? John Money. And need I tell you that the entire first chapter of this book is dedicated to debunking the ideas of John Money, and yet it doesn't demonstrate that the author has read even a single word of his work. So it's no wonder the book is filled with untrue information about him. Now, I could go on for hours about everything untrue in this book, but I'll try to keep it to things that are just related to John Money. In the first place, the entire conceit is that John Money invented gender ideology, a vague, unscientific term which appears not to have any real defined meaning, but which likely just means that people can change their gender or something. But even setting that aside, Grossman just flat out contradicts herself sometimes. Listen to this. He believed chromosomes and anatomy were irrelevant to the development of masculine and feminine identities, behaviors, and interests. Instead, he suggested children develop male or female qualities in the first years of life, based on how they are treated and on the expectations of others. Boys don't wear dresses or express their feelings. Girls aren't competitive or good at building things. To describe the identity imposed from without or socially constructed, he coined the term gender identity. Remember, that's also not fucking true. The year was 1957. Men impregnate, Money wrote. Women menstruate, ovulate, gestate, and lactate. All other distinctions are due to socialization. In the very same paragraph that she claims Money thought biology was irrelevant, she gives an example of how Money thought biology was relevant. She says that Money thought there was an equal chance of a given child identifying as male or female, which also isn't true, and that's in addition to some psychoanalysis that's pretty dubious. Again, I never met John Money. But it's fair to suggest his vision of gender divorced from sex served a purpose in the subconscious management of his childhood trauma. In his child psyche, not only his father, but all men were cruel. He didn't understand cruelty isn't part of manhood. It's a character trait. Women can be cruel too. She makes this claim that John Money invented ideas about transness because he hated that he was a man and resented his father. And guess what evidence she provides? Trick question, there is no evidence. However, that's all relatively less important compared to the central point, which is this. John Money was not a great man. He was a deviant, a degenerate even. But this framing is honestly a little bit silly. It seems to suggest that in order to be properly considered a good scientist or a good anything, you must be a good person. Lots of people who played influential roles in history or in our understanding of the world did terrible things. Many founding fathers owned slaves, as the left never tires of pointing out, but we nonetheless recognize their importance in the development of democracy. On the subject of democracy, did you hear about some of the shit that those French revolutionaries did? Maybe we should consider scrapping democracy. After all, have you considered all the horrible things that believers of democracy have done? In fact, supporters of democracy believe many of the same thing that these degenerates did about 250 years ago. Of course, we can say that certain ideas tend to lead to certain actions, and we can make generalizations about the correlation between word and deed. But what I'm saying is that if we have this standard where any given belief system has to have every influential person who believed it be a good person, no ideology would be spared. Moreover, when we talk about the causality between thoughts and behavior, it becomes important to know if there are any differences in what that person believes and what is believed now. Otherwise, you might do a tiny oopsies and do a silly thing like accidentally smear millions of innocent people as groomers and pedophiles. In the case of John Money, this expectation that Money will be dismissed for being a depraved lunatic is met with disappointment when he is met with honors and obituaries. According to Grossman, you could say Money was just another blemish of many in my profession. I accept that. There are bad apples. But you know what I can't understand? The adulation he received through the years upon his death and to this day. At a 1987 NIH meeting, John Money was honored as a scientist funded for 25 consecutive years. Infant sexual reassignment surgery was one of his most important clinical contributions to medical science. Following Money's death in 2007, Anke Ehrhardt, a psychologist who was his colleague and co-author, wrote, "He made extraordinary contributions. Scholars are indebted to him for his brilliance, his scientific contributions, and his passionate commitment to research and clinical care." No surprise, the Kinsey Institute called Money an extraordinary pioneer, a visionary researcher. They established the John Money collection of his personal and professional papers. We are most honored to have been the fortunate recipient of his support and his exceptional collection. Most honored? No. John Money was an emotionally disturbed, deviant child abuser who, seeking the recognition and fame he craved, exploited a simple working-class family who'd suffered a terrible tragedy. He was a public supporter of pedophilia and incest. Yet to this day, he's celebrated by at least some academics, physicians, and mental health professionals. Next time you're getting advice from someone with lots of diplomas, it's something to keep in mind. Now, personally, I think that doing the things that Money did should disqualify you from receiving academic honors. However, to take this as an adulation of the character of John Money, as opposed to an acknowledgement of his contributions to the field, I would say is wrong-headed. For the sake of transparency, I will mention that many of the claims about John Money's problematic behaviors are accurate, though there are some that I could not vouch the accuracy of one way or the other. For example, Money did indeed support pedophilia. He wrote the opening to a book, Boys on Their Contacts with Men, and he was, quote, interviewed favorably by pedophile movement publications such as Pedica and OK. However, Grossman adds to this claim an additional claim, an incorrect one. She claims that Money was a kind of subversive fetishist who rejected any and all sexual norms. To her, this is demonstrated by the fact that he disliked the psychiatric term perversion and suggested paraphilia in its place, arguing that the latter was less prejudicial and judgmental when describing people with unusual sexual behavior problems. Now, to begin with, this is standard academic behavior, though it is a standard that Grossman has been consistently critical of. However, she believes that this way that Money sought to decrease the bias in academic language is emblematic of a man who sought to decrease the stigma behind such activities at every turn. Money introduced the films to the Johns Hopkins Medical School curriculum in 1971. The show featured explicit photographs of people engaged in bestiality, urine drinking, feces eating, and various amputation fetishes. Money had also screened a stag film of 5 women and 3 men having group sex. Money was a depraved human being and advertised it to the world. Now we understand his campaign against the perversions category in psychiatry's Bible, the DSM. In fact, the term was dropped in the DSM-3, and paraphilias was adopted. Now, if this claim is true, I would say that showing students this type of pornography is certainly wrong. However, the claim that trying to destigmatize and decrease comfort with paraphilic material is indicative of wanting to promote it is patently absurd. While anger against disordered sexual behavior can be important, for instance, anger against sexual assault or rape, the academic environment is not the place for such emotions, at least not most of the time, as it makes your writing more biased, and these biases can then distort the truth. When talking about John Money specifically, it's worth noting that he left some pretty mixed messages on paraphilias. He described paraphilias as an antisocial and destructive force, a slow-spreading epidemic that at its limit poses a threat to the individual and to civilization, disrupting and disordering both the public and private order, as the epigraph from Bell suggests. However, in order to pursue this logic, Money needed to separate bad sexual abnormality, the clinical diagnostic concept of paraphilia, from the good sexual variation that he and his friends advocated and practiced. In other words, while there is truth to the idea that Mr. Money wanted to spread some certain, let's call them libertine ideas about sexuality, this libertarianism was caveated in a variety of ways. He wrote in one of his most famous books, Vandalized Love Maps, that he hoped for a world of paraphilia-free citizens, though to him a paraphilia was defined as a compulsive behavior. If you can get off without it, good. If not, you, sir, are a paraphiliac. And if you're a paraphiliac, then you need help. He also believed that the problem was the paraphilia as opposed to the paraphiliac, what Lisa Downing calls a hate the sin, love the sinner attitude. He spoke in the language of helping people attain an alternative to paraphilia, a wording that presupposes that such sexual behavior is bad and should be eliminated. In fact, you can even remember that Grossman herself argued that he wanted to introduce the term paraphilia to help people with sexual behavior problems. Now, I will say that Money's view is one that I think is filled with contradictions. For example, John Money was a believer in the acceptability of homosexual activity. But to be homosexual, or heterosexual for that matter, requires a certain set of stimuli for arousal, namely male or female features, and yet it was not classed as a paraphilia. However, this section is not to debunk Money's view of paraphilia, but Grossman's view of Money's view of paraphilia, so I will just suffice to say that she is wrong once again. The thing is that Grossman's interpretation of the Reimer case, it doesn't come from her having actually read what John Money thought or believed, and it doesn't come from her having read other scholarly opinions on the Reimer case. It comes from John Colapinto's As Nature Made Him. And while I wouldn't want to deny the importance of As Nature Made Him as a source, considering that Colapinto did work with David Reimer to help him do his inquiry, I think that taking the writings of Colapinto so uncritically is a bit of a problem. In the first place, John Colapinto did not cite any of his work, and he also had a tendency to take people who agreed with him fairly uncritically. But even setting that aside, Grossman actually contradicts several of the claims of Colapinto. Colapinto does mention that money was important in the history of transgenderism, but he also mentions the Jorgensen case as well as the cases of other trans women, who he outlines as having played an important role in convincing David's parents to let him transition toward being a girl to begin with. He positions Money as an important figure, and a person who made a mistake that he sees as being emblematic of certain attitudes toward gender. But he doesn't claim anything as dramatic or misleading as claiming that John Money was the father of anything, gender ideology or otherwise. Now, I would like to take a moment to borrow the words of Nikki Sullivan when she said, John Colapinto's characterization of Money as a constructionist is an inferential effect of the author's narrativization of a world of goodies and baddies, truth and lies, fact and fiction, males and females, rather than something that is convincingly argued through a close engagement with Money's writings. But despite this, Colapinto's text, and in particular his view of Money as a constructionist, seems largely to be taken as gospel. Now, wouldn't we also say that this is true today? That we've all kind of taken Colapinto's words uncritically, let people regurgitate them in a way that is not even necessarily accurate to his original intent all the time, and just kind of believed it because to say otherwise might be to align yourself with Money, to align yourself with a baddie. And I think a lot of this stuff about John Money has a whole lot more to do with gut level disgust than any sort of philosophical argument about the place of money or the place of problematic figures in the development of ideas. In the back of Grossman's book, there is such sage advice as, anime is not innocent. But there's also less funny advice, such as the idea that you should location track your child, cut off their internet, monitor all their messages, pull them out of schools, and that you shouldn't let sports, clubs, or anything else get in the way of family time. The overall message is clear. The internet is a corrupting influence. School is a corrupting influence. Your kids' friends are all potential corrupting influences. The outside world is corrupting your child. And the only way to combat this corruption is to become the ultimate helicopter mom, monitoring your kids at all times. One piece of advice has this to say: don't compromise with it. What would you do if a pimp or drug dealer moved in next door? What would you do if it turned out that the land or water where you live is poisoned? To many people, the idea that their child wouldn't express an alternate gender identity is equivalent to knowing that the land that they live on or the water that they drink is poisoned. This is the type of extreme rhetoric that follows from misinterpretations of the money case and from faulty philosophical formulations surrounding it. From this, it follows that neighbors would view other neighbors who affirm their children as poisoned. Also, Grossman pronounces Reimer as Reamer. I'm just saying, she can't even get his name right.
In 1965, Janet Reimer became the proud mother of identical twins.
The Reimer family.
So why did I spend so much time harping on this woman in particular? Isn't this video supposed to be about the history and about John Money himself? Well, yes, but I just think that Grossman is such a perfect encapsulation of everything that I think is wrong about our conversations about the money case, and she so thoroughly falls into every single faulty assumption about John Money. There really is this cottage industry of incredibly half-baked videos about John Money, which generally spout a lot of the same falsities, a lot of the same misinformation, a lot of the same oversimplifications, and most of them are just using Wikipedia and their stock footage website subscriptions. Grossman is just a particular target of my ire. She flaunts pseudo-academic pretensions while simultaneously not actually knowing the slightest thing about how research should be conducted. She uses her titles to gain trust while denigrating the systems that she received those titles from to begin with. And most importantly, she does not know a single damn thing about the supposed truths that she confidently proclaims to millions of people. I could have gone on. I could have talked about Matt Walsh or StevenCrowder or Benny Boy or fucking Triggernometry. But there's no point. They're all the same. No, as in exactly the same. They're the same talking points, the same misinformation, the same oversimplifications, the same citing of fucking Wikipedia, the same inability to actually engage with anything that John Money actually said. So there's no point. So what have we learned here? Well, I think that we've learned that John Money was not a revolutionary figure. He was somebody who had a modest contribution to the development of gender as an idea, but he was one part of that development, and even then, his role in it was arguably not that great. And no matter what Triggernometry tells you, the ideas of John Money are only kind of related to the ideas about gender that we have today. But of course, it doesn't matter, because if there's an easy grift where I can get on the content mill and just talk shit about John Money, it doesn't matter. Why do I need to read books? Why do I need to look up articles? I can just say shit. And that's why I wanted to close out this video telling you where you can actually go to learn about John Money and the Reimer case. I recommend 2 books. There's the classily named Fuckology, Critical Essays on John Money's Diagnostic Concepts from the University of Chicago Press, and The Man Who Invented Gender, Engaging the Ideas of John Money from the University of British Columbia. I don't claim to be an expert on John Money. I just know enough to know what these guys are saying is massively oversimplified. For this reason, if you have any additional interest in John Money and the Reimer case at all, I highly recommend you read people who actually know what they're talking about. Not YouTubers like Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, or yes, even me. But if you choose to be ignorant, if you choose to spew bullshit without thinking, don't worry. You'd make a great YouTuber.